David Tafuri, former Obama campaign foreign policy advisor, former State Department official. David, thanks very much for coming on the show. Appreciate it. I take it away. Tell me where you agree or disagree with anything that I just said.
Great to be with you, Dan. Thank you. I was in Ukraine a couple weeks ago, and what I heard there and saw there reflected weariness over the war. So I think you're right that the Ukrainian people do want peace, but they don't want peace under any terms. And I agree with a lot of what you said, but where I perhaps disagree is the confidence that you have in Putin and perhaps the confidence that President Trump has in Putin being ready to bargain in good faith. I'm not sure he is. So Putin was happy, I'm sure, to do these prisoner releases. He wants to give Trump something. He wants to show that he's being cooperative. And he wants to demonstrate that he intends to go into these negotiations trying to find a solution. And that's why he's agreed to do these talks. And we always thought these talks would happen. President Trump, to his credit, has insisted that talks have to happen. And so it's great that he's started pushing for these talks now. And Putin said yes. But he said yes, maybe just to appear as if he intends to enter into a reasonable agreement. I'm not sure he does, because you have to look at what Putin wants. Does he want just the pre-February 2022 borders that he had when which would include part of eastern Ukraine and Crimea, which he annexed, or does he want more than that? I think he wants more than that. He wants to control Ukraine. Doesn't necessarily need to occupy all of Ukraine, but he wants Ukraine to be a puppet country, similar to some of the other countries that are former Soviet states. And to do a deal where he agrees to, giving up the territory he's taken since February 2022 when he invaded, and agree that there would be security guarantees from Europe, would mean that he doesn't control Ukraine. I would also say that where I disagree, perhaps, I give President Trump and Pete Hegseth a lot of credit for some of the things they've done. The most important thing they've done is they've continued the weapons shipments to Ukraine. That hasn't been talked a lot about, but I've heard that from contacts that those are continuing, right? And we didn't know if they were going to continue, because President Trump talked on the campaign like maybe he would stop the weapons shipments, but they've continued. And the reason the Trump administration has continued them is to keep the pressure on Putin. That's a really good thing, and I think that sets the table for a better negotiation. But my fear is that Putin doesn't really want to go into to give give the things that Zelensky needs to enter into a deal. And I think where I disagree perhaps with what Secretary of Defense Hegseth said is where he said that only Europe would give a security guarantee. Realistically, I'm not sure that's enough for Zelensky to do a deal. Imagine you do a deal with the much larger Russia, much larger army. You enter into a deal. You can't trust Putin. The only way you can trust him is if he fears breaking the deal. But you get a security guarantee from Europe and not America. Can you imagine a scenario where Europe would fight Russia to defend Ukraine if Russia invaded Ukraine again without the United States? It's hard to imagine. So I think U.S. has to be part of that security guarantee.
Really interesting points. But let's try and nail that down a little bit, because you're talking about sort of what we're both talking about, what Ukraine can accept and what Putin actually will do or won't do. I mean, look, at some point, right, you have to be, if you're going to enter a deal, you have to be willing to accept that Putin is going to do what he says he's going to do to some degree, right?
You do, but the average Ukrainian does not accept that, because this started before 2014. I mean, they have been dealing with Russia putting, incredible pressure on their country, interfering in their politics, having influence over their presidents. They tried to get rid of all that in 2014 in the Maidan Revolution. They kicked out Yanukovych, who was essentially the president of Ukraine, but was a puppet of Putin. And they've seen that Putin will not let them go. And so I don't think they trust him. They could be a deal, but I think they would think he would break it.
Talking to David Tafuri, Is Tafuri the correct pronunciation, by the way?
Tafuri.
Tafuri. Talking to David
Yep.
Tafuri, former campaign foreign policy advisor to President Obama, former State Department official, about the breaking news out of, well, it's coming out of Germany because Pete Hegseth has been speaking out of Germany, but about the Ukraine-Russia war. So what do you see practically happening? I mean, it seems to me that Trump wants a quote-unquote win, right? And a win for Trump is a deal. He doesn't care what the terms are. I don't think Trump cares. He just wants to be able to say, I'm the one who negotiated a deal. I'm the one who made it happen. I'm going to make it happen. And it seems to me that that is going to involve taking Putin's word for it to some degree and then pushing Zelensky really hard.
Yes, I agree. And I think President Zelensky, he hasn't said this publicly, and Ukrainians don't want to admit this, but I think they're ready to concede some territory. And realistically, parts of eastern Ukraine and Crimea are so far under the influence of Russia that it would be hard to actually bring them back into Ukraine and keep them peaceful. So I think they would be willing to give up those territories, even though they might not say it, in a tough negotiation. But what Zelensky has to have, is a security guarantee that he can rely on that will create the leverage for Russia not to break any deal. And I think that is either entry into NATO, which Secretary of Defense Hegseth was skeptical about that in his comments, or a separate bilateral country-to-country security guarantee from the United States and from the major European military powers like England and France.
Well, Hegseth has been more than just skeptical, right? I mean, he's basically. I mean, let me play another piece of sound. This is number 15. He's saying it's a non-starter. This is Secretary Hegseth today.
The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5.
So, but your point is, okay, take NATO off the table, but just have a one-on-one deal. Boy, would the Ukrainians trust Trump to keep to that deal?
Well, I think they would have to, right? It would be really harmful to President Trump politically if he gave a security guarantee to Ukraine and then Russia turned around, broke the deal, reinvaded Ukraine, and he didn't do anything. He would look so weak. So I think the Ukraine could trust a security guarantee from the United States. And let me also comment on NATO. Hegseth says that he doesn't want Ukraine to be part of NATO. It's obviously not only up to the United States, it's up to all the NATO countries. So any state can veto a new entrant to NATO. But NATO accession for Ukraine was never going to happen in the next 4 years. It's a 5 to 10 year process. Right. So you could keep them in line still towards eventually becoming part of NATO and getting that security guarantee that comes with NATO in the future. And that decision could be made by the next administration. It doesn't necessarily have to be made by this administration. It can be kicked down the field, but you give them hope that eventually they could be part of NATO. Remember, there are really other good reasons for Ukraine to be part of NATO. Ukraine is now the most experienced military in Europe, right? Other than Russia, right? True. They've been fighting nearly a 3-year war with Russia. They have really well-trained troops. They know how to fight a modern war with drones. They have developed a lot of technology that could be useful. They have a very large army. Imagine they would be actually very beneficial to the collective security of NATO as a future NATO member.
Talking to David Tafuri, who was a foreign policy advisor in the Obama administration, bringing up some really important, nuanced points about this ongoing negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. But I think that the bottom line is that there is no doubt that Ukraine's going to have to give up some territory. And the question becomes, can they get a deal? And if they do, I think we both have been saying that Trump will deserve credit as long as it's something that's enforceable. All right, I had actually invited David on the show to talk about a different topic. Let's talk Gaza. I don't know what the heck he is talking about. We're going to take Gaza and just rebuild it? You don't think that Hamas isn't going to come out and start attacking from the tunnels that still exist? The now American contractors who are there? This seems to me to be truly bananas, but he seems serious about it. And let me play a little bit more. And by the way, we'll be taking your calls on both Ukraine and on the Gaza situation. This is Donald Trump with Bret Baier a couple days ago, sort of laying out the plan, number two.
We'll build beautiful communities for the 1.9 million people. We'll build beautiful communities, safe communities. Could be 5, 6, could be 2, but we'll build safe communities a little bit away from where they are, where all of this danger is. In the meantime, I would own this. Think of it as a real estate development for the future. It would be a beautiful piece of land.
Would the Palestinians have the right to return?
Spent. No, they wouldn't, because they're going to have much better housing, much better. In other words, I'm talking about building a permanent place for them. Because if they have to return now, it'll be years before you could ever. It's not habitable. It will be years before it could happen. I'm talking about starting to build, and I think I could make a deal with Jordan. I think I could make a deal with Egypt. You know, we give them billions and billions of dollars a year.
So the deal so far appears to be that Jordan will take 2,000 children. Okay. I mean, where are the other 1.898 million people going? And Trump has started to stop talking about withholding aid. But I don't even see how this is possible. And those of you who listen to the show regularly will know. The first time he said this, I said, this is ridiculous. Don't even listen. He's just talking. It doesn't seem he's talking anymore. It seems like this is like a thing. Let's go back to David Tafuri, former campaign foreign policy advisor during the Obama administration, former State Department official. David, what do you make of this?
I'm like you. I'm not really sure what to make of it. All of the questions you raised are the same questions I have. I have other questions too. I mean, President Trump wants to move them to Jordan or Egypt. We're talking about moving 2 million plus people. And assuming that you could get those countries to agree, and they don't agree and won't agree. But let's say you did. What is the status of the Palestinians then? Are they? Do they get a Palestinian state inside Egypt or inside Jordan? I don't think Egypt or Jordan want that. Do they become citizens of Egypt and Jordan? I don't think those two countries want that either. Jordan already has, a huge population of Palestinians who were displaced into Jordan. So there are a lot of things that have not been worked out. And I just wonder if Trump, who has been spitballing on this idea, has fully thought it out, or is this some sort of negotiation tactic? Because one thing I will note is that all of a sudden, Egypt and Jordan and other countries in the Middle East have come forward and said, hey, we're going to give you a plan to rebuild Gaza where the Palestinians can stay, right? Now, all of a sudden, they're really interested in helping rebuild Gaza, which I don't think they were excited about before. Now, they're so scared that President Trump may try to force the Palestinians on them that maybe they'll be more cooperative in the rebuilding of Gaza. But in the end, the Palestinians are going to stay in Gaza. And it's going to take a lot of creativity, a lot of resources, and a lot of determination to rebuild Gaza so it becomes a place where it's safe and it's their humanitarian needs are met.
That would be an amazing success as well for the Trump administration if that were to happen, right? Meaning if Egypt and Jordan were to decide, okay, we'll take at least some of the aid money we get from the United States and put in some of our own to invest in helping to rebuild Gaza, that would be a pretty big win, right?
Yeah, that would be a huge win. You know, these countries who always side with the Palestinians and claim to have, an affinity for the Palestinians and to care deeply about their right to self-determination and to have a state, often don't do enough to actually support the Palestinians. And in the end, if the Palestinians get a state, it's going to depend upon support from other Arab nations. And if it doesn't get that support, it would be a failed state.
But let me ask you this. What happens on Saturday, right? I mean, Donald Trump has offered a deadline of Saturday at noon for Hamas to return all the hostages, right? That's not going to happen. I mean, all the hostages aren't going to be returned by Saturday, even if, the peace deal gets back on track, et cetera. What happens then?
I'm very worried about this, and I don't understand why President Trump would approach it in this way, because he took credit and he deserves some credit for getting the ceasefire, right? I think it was actually a collaboration between the Biden administration that was still in the White House and the Trump administration that was coming in and putting a lot of pressure on Israel and on Hamas. They got the ceasefire, and it now seems about to fall apart. And I don't think that's a good thing for Trump or for the Trump administration. So I hope that he returns to putting, to commitment to the ceasefire and putting pressure on both sides. Because remember, neither Hamas nor Israel love this ceasefire, right? They're probably looking for excuses to get out of it, and now they're finding them.
Yeah. And if this thing falls apart, it gets a lot harder to obviously fix the other problems. And more importantly, it means that Israel will be back in Gaza, trying to root out Hamas again and doing more destruction and damage to Gaza as well. All right, so let's do this. Let's take some of your calls. You get an opportunity to talk to someone who is a real expert on the region, in David Tafuri, not just in the Middle East, but you heard he was just in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago. So two topics. Number one, the ongoing discussions between the administration in Ukraine and Russia, and the comments we were making before about Ukraine's going to have to accept that they're not going to be able to get back to the pre-2014 borders, but also, can you trust Putin? And then this Gaza proposal, and how exactly this is going to work, and does it fit into a larger plan, et cetera. Let's go to Steve in California. Steve, how you doing? What's going on?
Good afternoon. I have a quick question regarding NATO and Ukraine. Before this war, did not Putin say that NATO going into Ukraine was the red line and we didn't listen? And basically, they don't want NATO on their borders. They want a little bit of a room between. And we decided we're going to make Ukraine take NATO. That's what
David
I heard.
Tafuri. Is that true?
I don't agree with the premise of that. First of all, we didn't make Ukraine take NATO. Ukraine wants to be part of the EU. It wants to be Western. It wants to be a democracy. It wants a very different system of government and a very different vision for its people than what Russia has. And it wants freedom. And it sees the Western countries and Western Europe and the United States as a guarantor of that freedom. NATO is a defensive alliance. NATO has never attacked any country. Russia really has no reason to worry about NATO being on its border. But more importantly, it's not up to Russia. Ukraine is a sovereign country. Russia agreed to it being sovereign, signed an agreement for it to be sovereign after the Soviet Union fell apart. And Russia has no right to decide whether Ukraine is part of NATO or not. It's up to the Ukrainians and it's up to the NATO countries.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it. Let's go to Lisa in Michigan. Lisa, how you doing? What's going on?
Hey, I'm just so disappointed in Americans, and I'm so grateful you took my phone call. We convinced Ukraine to get rid of their nukes about 20 years ago, and we would always have their back with our allies. And I bet right now they're saying if we would have had our nukes, Russia never would have attacked us. They trusted us. We were trying to get worldwide nukes eliminated from the planet. And, you know, with Trump telling countries they got to divvy up more money for defense, you know, if I were some of those European countries, I'd be saying, okay, I'm going to start building nukes in my country too. But
let me ask David Tafuri this question, a former State Department official in the Obama administration. Do you think that if Ukraine had moved forward with a nuclear weapon, that Russia would not have attacked?
So, first of all, your caller is absolutely right. Right, we, the U.S., the U.K., and Russia induced Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons after the fall of the Soviet Union. It had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. That was a decisive moment for them when they decided to do that. They did that out of loyalty to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and with the understanding that they would be respected as a sovereign country and they would be protected. And by giving up those nuclear weapons, I do think they gave up, leverage and a security tool that might have made Russia less willing to pick on Ukraine and to invade Ukraine. And so I agree with your caller, and the premise of what your caller is saying is right, which is if we want other countries to give up their nuclear weapons or other countries not to take nuclear weapons, we have to be even more guarded about helping protect their sovereignty and ensuring that the international community protects their sovereignty.
Lisa, thank you. John is in Georgia. Hello, John. What do you got today?
Yeah, hi, Dan. Well, this guy kind of forgets a few things, like Ukraine had neutrality built into their constitution at the time, and also the United States promised not to move NATO 1 inch past Germany. But you should remember the background for this whole thing is that these regions in eastern Ukraine were part of Russia for 150 years. They've only been part of an independent Ukraine for 30 years. And after the pro-Russian Ukrainian government was overthrown in 2014, they started oppressing the people, the ethnic Russians in these areas, including they burned alive 35 people in Odessa. So these people seceded from Ukraine, and the Russians came in to help them. That's how the war started.
So you actually believe, hang on, John, you actually believe that the war started because Putin came in to help the Russians?
You know, read Jeffrey Sachs, read a whole bunch of other people. You haven't read anything on this whole thing. You're just taking a...
Oh, is that right? Is that right? Because I don't know anything, right? Because the notion that I think that Vladimir Putin didn't go in to protect Russians makes me ignorant, right? I've read a lot on this, but more importantly, the good news for today is I don't need to argue with you guys. I've got David Tafuri here who does this for a living. So, David, a lot to unpack in John's comments, but go ahead, take it away.
I mean, he's wrong on every single point, factually. The things he said are basically Putin propaganda talking points. I think the one writer he mentioned is one of the only writers who writes that, and it is not based on the facts of the historical record. The first thing he said, which is that the U.S. guaranteed never to extend NATO past Germany, that's not true. The United States never made any such promise. That's never put in writing. Putin claims that, President Reagan said that at one point, but those who were in those meetings with President Reagan deny that he said that. So that isn't established as a fact, and many who were in those meetings say that didn't happen. But more importantly, the claim that Putin had to invade Russia to protect ethnic Russians, this is the oldest trick in the book, right? This is what Hitler did. He claimed he had to protect ethnic Germans when he went into Czechoslovakia, right? So that's what dictators, authoritarian leaders do. They come up with a pretext to invade other countries.
Yeah, and what do you make of his comment? He was talking about the 35 Russians who were burned alive in Odessa, et cetera, and that's sort of was an impetus.
I mean, I'm not familiar with that specific incident, but there was a great deal of harmony in Russia after after it became independent and sovereign. Russian speakers were not mistreated in Ukraine. In fact, most Ukrainians spoke Russian. There was, it's just simply not true.
Right.
Ukraine is.
I'm pulling it up.
Doesn't have perfect human rights. Yeah.
I'm pulling up the article
Go
right
ahead.
now. Ukraine clashes, dozens dead after Odessa building fire. Trade union building set alight after days of street battles in Black Sea resort city. More than 30 people were killed in violent and chaotic clashes in southern Ukraine city of Odessa on Friday as pro-Ukraine activists stormed a building defended by protesters opposed to the current government in Kiev and in favor of closer ties with Russia. The violence continued on Saturday as Ukraine said its forces had attacked pro-Russian separatists, blah, blah, blah. But the notion that this is 2014, that in 2022, that was somehow the justification makes no sense. Let's go to Aaron in Missouri. Aaron, what do you got?
Yeah, I just have a quick question for you. Thanks for taking my call, by the way. My question is would there be anything stopping Ukraine from signing defense treaties independent of NATO with its bordering countries that would border Russia? If that makes any sense.
Well, it does, except I think that many of those countries, and again, I'd have to pull up a map for a moment. David Tafuri, I'm sure, knows this better than me, but like Belarus, are effectively controlled by Russia. But David, go ahead.
Well, Poland and Romania are on Ukraine's border, and they're both NATO countries. They're both supportive of NATO. They're assisting NATO with its defense against Russia. There would be nothing stopping them from doing a defense agreement. But the problem is that isn't on its own going to deter Russia. Like, Russia doesn't fear Poland's army or Romania's army. What Russia fears is the Western armies, the NATO alliance, and the United States.
Yeah. Aaron, thank you. Larry's in Florida. Larry, how you doing? What do you got?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good. There's a real debate about whether the U.S. provoked Russia into this. If you go back to 1992, Boris Yeltsin got a standing ovation from the U.S. Congress. The majority of American people thought we were entering a new era of positive relationship with Russia. The New York Times opined that. And here we are 30-some years later, and Russia's a mortal nuclear-armed enemy aligned with other nuclear-armed enemies. You got to ask yourself, how the hell did that happen? And the one point I want to make, so if you've read a lot about this, you probably can explain how that happened.
Well, because you're suggesting it just sort of happens as opposed to Vladimir Putin making it happen.
No, I'm saying the U.S. and NATO made it happen with the expansion of NATO. With
because you know, right? Because as opposed to it being any responsibility of Putin's, right? It's all the U.S. and NATO, which is forcing Putin to behave like a dictator and to behave like an imperialist, right? That's the U.S. and NATO's fault.
I think every time I bring this up, I'm accused of being a Putin apologist. I'm not. Here's the exception I want to take to what somebody said. NATO did attack somebody. NATO attacked Serbia, and Serbia is a very close ally of Russia. You might recall that Russia went to war in 1914 to protect Serbia. They have a kindred spirit. So Russia has a lot to fear from.
So wait, just, and I'm going to let David Tafuri fact check, but so your suggestion is that based on a relationship from 1914, that justifies Putin invading or explains Putin invading Ukraine in 2022.
Oh, when I said it all, Christ. Goodbye.
Bye, Larry. Go ahead, David.
Well, your caller has a point in that NATO did airstrikes in the Balkans. The purpose, of course, was to prevent a genocide, which Serbia, was leading against Bosnian Muslims, and to protect Bosnia. And ultimately was successful in stopping the genocide. And an important point is that while NATO, in order to defend Bosnia and the Bosnian people, did have to do airstrikes in Serbia, it didn't take any Serbian territory. The goal was not to invade Serbia, to take Serbia. Serbia is still a sovereign country. It was to end a genocide.
All right, so Larry, you get a fair point on that one, but not a fair point on the other. Sydney's in Florida. Sydney, how you doing? What's going on?
Yeah, thank you. I have a question. Does it take a unanimous vote of NATO to allow a new member?
David?
Yes, it does. And in fact, if you remember last year, Sweden wanted to join NATO, and all countries agreed that Sweden should be part of NATO. And it was held up by one country, Turkey, which had issues with related to the Kurdish population in Sweden. Ultimately, that was worked out, and Sweden is now a member of NATO. But an example of how one country can veto membership for a new country is that one.
Sydney, thank you. Let's go to Ken in New York. Ken, what do you got?
Hi, thanks for taking my call. My question is, if Donald Trump is such a great negotiator, how did he begin his negotiations, or how did he sum up his phone call with Vladimir Putin by saying that Ukraine will not join NATO and Ukraine should not expect to get any territory back from what Russia seized? How do you begin a negotiation by conceding your adversary's major 2 points?
Because that was probably the condition to begin the negotiation. You have to say that, not that they're not going to get any, but that you have to say they're not going to get back to 2014 and that they're not going to be a member of NATO. And if you can make that public statement, we can begin to have a conversation, which, by the way, isn't going to be a surprise to Ukraine, right? It's not like Ukraine heard that and was like, oh my God, no way. They know that at this point. So I don't see why that's a bad negotiating technique.
But Donald Trump is taking Vladimir Putin's position. Donald Trump is saying, yeah, that's okay. We won't have them join NATO. So what protection is Ukraine going to have from Russia just building up their army and invading them in the future?
Well, that's going to be the challenge, right? That's exactly what David Tafuri was talking about a moment ago. He was saying that there's going to have to be some sort of security arrangement that is imposed to ensure for Ukraine's protection. Exactly what that looks like, we shall see. Mark is in South Carolina. Mark, what do you got?
Yeah, this might be a little water under the bridge, but since we have David, I wanted to know, when Biden put the sanctions on Russia very early on, and then he said, oh, well, wait 30 days, and they didn't appear to work. And I was just curious of what your thought was of why the sanctions didn't seem to have any impact.
David Tafuri.
A really good question. The sanctions did have an impact. They have hurt Russia's economy. And it's a combination of the sanctions, the price cap on oil sales by Russia, which was agreed to by the G7 countries and imposed on many countries, although some don't follow it, and also restrictions on exports to Russia, and specifically restrictions on export of U.S. technology to Russia. Those three kind of economic measures did have an impact, but they didn't have enough of an impact, right? They hurt Russia's revenues, but not enough to make a huge difference. And one of the mistakes I think that the Biden administration made is it put these in place, but then it didn't continue to augment them and add to them and ratchet them up. And what happens with sanctions is that countries that are the subject of sanctions learn how to evade them. And so what Russia did is it set up new payment mechanisms to avoid the U.S. banking system. It created new shipping companies, which they call the shadow fleet of ships that carry their oil, and did other things. And the U.S. wasn't responding quickly enough with our allies to add to the sanctions to eliminate those loopholes that Russia found.
David Tafuri, former Obama campaign foreign policy advisor, former State Department official. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the program. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.